I never expected that a simple favor from my sister would lead to such a dramatic shift in my life. My name is Oliver. I'm 29 and I've been married to Emily, a wonderful woman, for 4 years. Emily works full-time as a marketing manager, while I've carved out a career for myself as a freelance writer, which allows me the flexibility to work from home. It's a lifestyle that works for us. I get to spend a lot of time with our 2 young sons, Luke and Henry, who are 5 and 3 years old, respectively. In the early years of our marriage, I took on the role of a primary caregiver for the kids, while Emily focused on her career. It wasn't an arrangement that felt odd to either of us. It just worked. Emily enjoyed the challenge of her high-powered job, while I enjoyed the quiet routine of managing the household. It wasn't that I didn't have ambitions. I did. But it was always clear to me that family was the priority. My job allowed me to be present for my children, the sort of father I wanted to be. At the same time, I wasn't ashamed of my role as the stay-at-home dad. It suited me, and Emily and I were content. We lived in a quiet suburban town just outside of Seattle, not far from my younger sister, Claire, and her family. Claire, 27, was married to Daniel, a 32-year-old attorney. They had one child, a 6-year-old girl named Sophie. Unlike Emily and me, Claire and Daniel both worked full-time, which meant their schedules were packed. I'd known Claire since we were kids, and we had always been close, so when she asked if I could occasionally help take care of Sophie while they worked, I didn't hesitate. I liked the idea of having Sophie over, and I thought it would be nice for Luke and Henry to have a playmate. Initially, it was a win-win situation. Sophie enjoyed the time spent with her cousins, and I could use the opportunity to teach her how to do some fun activities that would entertain all 3 kids. I'd drive Sophie to school in the mornings, help her with homework, and make meals for all of them. It gave me a sense of purpose, and I thought that I was doing something good for my family. I had no problems with the arrangement. Sophie was a sweet girl, and despite the minor squabbles that would sometimes arise between her and my kids, things generally went smoothly. But then, something happened. It was a seemingly innocent comment that Sophie made one afternoon while I was preparing dinner. It wasn't anything I had expected, and, honestly, it caught me off guard. I was making sandwiches for the kids when I overheard her arguing with Luke. Sophie was trying to explain something about the roles people had in the house. "You're a girl, Luke," Sophie had exclaimed. "Girls do things like clean up and make dinner." Luke, who was 5 at the time, seemed confused. "But I don't want to make dinner," he replied, his tiny voice laced with defiance. "No, you don't have to," Sophie said with a matter-of-fact tone, "because Daddy makes dinner. And Daddy is the one who cleans up. He's not like the other dads. Daddy's different." I froze. The comment hit me like a slap to the face. Sophie's words were simple, but there was a weight to them. I didn't know exactly why, but it bothered me. It wasn't just the fact that she was associating cooking and cleaning with femininity. It was the implication that I, as a stay-at-home dad, was somehow not man enough in her eyes. Her comment, though innocent, made me feel like I was playing into some outdated stereotype. I took a deep breath and tried to push the feelings aside, but they lingered. Later that evening, I casually brought up the conversation with Emily. "You know, Sophie said something weird today," I said as I set the table for dinner. Emily looked up from her phone, a little distracted. "Oh? What did she say?" "She said that I do things like make dinner and clean up because I'm a girl," I explained, trying to keep the tone light, though I could tell I wasn't doing a great job of hiding my irritation. Emily blinked, clearly surprised. "That's strange. She probably just doesn't know how to explain things properly, right?" "I don't know," I replied, frustrated. "It's more than that. It feels like she's been picking up on some ideas from somewhere, and it's starting to affect how she sees me. And what's worse, I'm not sure if her parents, Claire and Daniel, are aware of how they might be influencing her." Emily paused, setting her phone down. "Well, I'm sure she didn't mean anything by it. Kids say all sorts of things. Maybe you should talk to Claire about it." I didn't want to, but I knew Emily had a point. If Sophie's comments were based on something she'd overheard or learned at home, it would be important to address it early, before it became a bigger issue. I didn't want to make a scene, but I also couldn't just ignore it. I felt like my masculinity was being called into question, and it was hard to shake that feeling. The next day, I decided to talk to Claire about it. Sophie had spent the night at our house, and when I dropped her off at her parents' place in the morning, I made sure to bring it up. I waited until Sophie was inside before I started the conversation with Claire. Hey, there's something I wanted to talk to you about, I said as I turned to face her. It's about Sophie. Claire looked up, concerned immediately registering on her face. What happened? Is she okay? No. Everything's fine, I reassured her. It's just something Sophie said the other day. She mentioned that I make dinner and clean up like I'm a girl. I just thought it was worth mentioning, because I'm not sure where she's picking up these ideas. Claire frowned. She said that? She asked, her tone hinting at both surprise and mild concern. But she's just a kid, Ollie. She probably doesn't really understand what she's saying. I mean, she's been in daycare for years, and I'm sure she's picked up some stuff there. You know how kids are. I get that, but it's not just that, I replied. I've been thinking about it, and it feels like she's picking up some gendered ideas about roles that are really outdated, and it's starting to affect how she views me. I'm just trying to figure out where it's coming from. Claire looked uncomfortable. Well, I don't know what to tell you, Ollie. Daniel and I have talked about gender roles before, but honestly, I think it's just one of those things. Sophie doesn't mean anything by it. But even as Claire spoke, I could tell she wasn't really hearing me. I felt the weight of the conversation slip away from me, as if it was no longer a priority for her. I wanted to push further, but something in the way she shrugged it off made me hesitate. Well, I just wanted to mention it, I said, trying not to sound too bitter. I'm sure it's no big deal. I just wanted to let you know. The conversation with Claire stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't that I expected her to suddenly change her entire perspective on gender roles, but the way she brushed it off made me feel like I was overreacting. I tried to convince myself it wasn't a big deal kids say weird things all the time, right? But as days passed, Sophie's comment kept creeping into my mind. And it wasn't just the comment itself, it was the way it made me feel, like I wasn't living up to some unspoken expectation of what a man is supposed to be. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I didn't want Sophie or anyone thinking that my role as a father was somehow less valid just because I wasn't following some outdated blueprint of masculinity. There was a quiet tension starting to build inside me, something I couldn't shake. Emily noticed it, of course. She always did. That's one of the things I loved about her, how she could read me so well. It had been a few days since I'd talked to Claire, and the pressure of the whole thing was still hanging over me. I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something needed to change. One night, as I was washing dishes after dinner, Emily came up behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're not okay, are you?" she asked softly, her voice laced with concern. I set the dish down, turning to face her. "I don't know. It's been bothering me, the way Sophie said that stuff the other day. And honestly, Claire didn't take it seriously when I mentioned it." Emily raised an eyebrow. "She didn't?" "No," I sighed, rubbing my face. "She kind of just shrugged it off, said Sophie didn't know what she was talking about. But I don't know. It just feels like it's bigger than that." Emily was silent for a moment, processing. I could see her mind working through the situation, trying to find the right words. Finally, she spoke. "I get why it bothers you," she said gently. "But Ollie, we can't control what Sophie says. And we definitely can't control what Claire and Daniel are teaching her. All we can do is make sure our kids understand that there's no right or wrong way to be a man or a woman. That we're all individuals, no matter what our roles are in the house." I nodded slowly. "I know. But I guess it just feels like I'm always the one who has to defend myself. I'm not ashamed of what I do. But I don't want anyone, especially Sophie, to think that the way I live is wrong." Emily pulled me into a hug. "I understand. It's frustrating, but you're doing a great job with the kids. I know it's not easy, but you're showing them every day that being a good parent isn't about fitting into some mold. It's about love, patience, and the willingness to be there for them when they need you." Her words were soothing, but deep down, I knew that this wasn't just about Sophie. It wasn't even about what Claire thought. It was about me. About the fact that I had spent so much of my life thinking that my worth as a man was tied to what I could do in a job, how much money I could make, or whether I fit into the image of what a manly man was supposed to look like. I didn't realize how much I had internalized those expectations until this whole situation with Sophie had brought them to the surface. It was like a slow, uncomfortable realization that I had been living with these subtle insecurities, and I hadn't even known it. The next morning, I woke up early, not wanting to waste any more time stewing over the whole thing. I decided to talk to Emily again, but this time, I wasn't just going to vent. I wanted to find a solution. I wanted to stop letting this subtle discomfort linger between us, as if something was off. "I've been thinking," I said over breakfast, as Emily poured her coffee. "Maybe it's time I have a more serious conversation with Claire. Maybe I've been too passive about this whole thing. I need to make it clear that I'm not just some anomaly in their eyes. I'm not some lesser version of a dad just because I stay at home and take care of the kids. I'm just as important as Daniel, or any other dad out there." Emily nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "I think that's a good idea. If it's bothering you this much, it might be time to address it directly with Claire. But just remember, don't do it in a way that makes it feel like a confrontation. You don't want to put her on the defensive." I appreciated her advice. Emily was always good at helping me see things from a different perspective. I knew that the last thing I wanted to do was escalate the situation, but at the same time, I couldn't let this feeling fester. I needed to be true to myself, even if it meant making others uncomfortable. The tension from the past week weighed heavily on me, but I was determined to handle it in a way that felt right. I had to set boundaries, not just for myself, but for my family as well. This wasn't just about defending my role as a stay-at-home dad, it was about reclaiming my confidence, my identity, and my sense of self-worth. And I knew it had to start with that conversation with Claire. I couldn't avoid it any longer. The discomfort in my chest was building every day, and I knew that if I didn't address it soon, I would only end up resenting the situation more. Emily was right. I had to talk to Claire. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about clearing the air, putting my foot down, and making sure that everyone understood where I stood. I wasn't just a dad on the side, because I didn't fit into their idea of what a man should be. I was a full-time parent, and that was just as valid as anything Daniel was doing. I wasn't sure how to start the conversation. We'd always gotten along, but the recent tension had shifted things. Claire was one of those people who didn't really hear you unless you were blunt. She had a way of brushing things off that made you feel like your concerns didn't matter. But this time, I wasn't going to let that happen. I needed her to listen, and I needed to be clear about why I was upset. It was late in the afternoon when I finally decided to reach out. I texted her, asking if we could talk after the kids went to bed. A simple request, but I could already tell this wasn't going to be a light conversation. Claire responded almost immediately, agreeing to meet at the park around the corner from our houses. I felt a bit nervous as I walked to the park. It wasn't that I was afraid of Claire, but I was afraid of not getting my point across. I didn't want to come off as defensive or petty, but I also didn't want to back down. My role as a father was just as valuable as anyone else's, and I wasn't going to let that be minimized. When I saw her sitting on the bench by the swings, I took a deep breath and walked over. Claire was casually dressed in a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, her blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail. She smiled when she saw me, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She probably sensed this wasn't going to be a casual chat. "Hey, Ollie," she greeted me with a nod. "What's on your mind?" I sat down beside her, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing on my chest. "I've been thinking about what Sophie said the other day," I began, trying to sound as calm as possible. "And I've been thinking about how you responded when I brought it up. I feel like there's something we need to clear up." Claire's expression shifted slightly, and she leaned back, crossing her arms. "Okay," she said, clearly bracing herself. "What's the issue?" I let out a slow breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "The issue is that I'm tired of feeling like I'm not enough, that the way I parent, the way I'm raising my kids, is somehow less valid because I'm not doing it the way Daniel does it. I know I don't fit the typical dad mold, and I'm okay with that. But when Sophie says things like that, it hits me in a place I don't think she even understands." Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my frankness. "Sophie didn't mean anything by it, Ollie. She's just a kid, and kids say stuff without thinking. You know how it is." "I get that," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "But it's not just about Sophie. It's about the fact that you and Daniel have this very specific view of what it means to be a man, a dad, and honestly, it doesn't always fit with who I am. I'm doing something different, and I'm proud of it. But when I bring it up, I feel like it gets brushed aside, like it doesn't matter." Claire was quiet for a moment, her eyes thoughtful as she processed what I said. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, and for the first time, I felt like she was really listening. She exhaled deeply and then turned toward me, uncrossing her arms. "I didn't realize you felt that way," she said slowly. "I guess I've always seen you as a bit Different, but not in a bad way. You know, I've never had an issue with you being a stay-at-home dad, but I suppose I've just assumed that you were okay with that choice, and that it didn't bother you when people saw it as unconventional. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. I am okay with it, for the most part. But sometimes it feels like I have to explain myself more than anyone else. I just don't want Sophie growing up thinking that dads are only valuable if they're out working 9 to 5. I want her to see that a dad's worth isn't determined by what he does for a paycheck, but by how he shows up for his family, Claire sighed, her gaze softening. I can see that. I didn't mean to make you feel like you had to explain yourself. I guess I just didn't realize how much it was eating at you. I'm sorry if I made you feel less than. It was the apology I needed to hear, but I wasn't ready to let everything go just yet. It's not just about the apology, Claire. I need you to understand that I'm doing just as much work as Daniel. I might not be out in an office, but I'm here with my kids, making sure they grow up with love and stability. And that matters, just as much. She nodded again, more solemn now. I get it, Ollie. I really do. I'll be more mindful in the future. I didn't mean to make you feel like you weren't doing enough. I guess I just didn't understand how all this was affecting you. I exhaled, finally feeling like we were on the same page. Thanks, Claire. That means a lot to me. She smiled, the tension between us easing. No problem. I'll make sure I'm more thoughtful moving forward. And if Sophie says something that bothers you again, just let me know. We'll talk about it. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had finally said what needed to be said. It wasn't just about Claire or Sophie, it was about me. It was about feeling validated in my role as a father and as a man, no matter what society or anyone else thought. I was proud of who I was and how I was raising my kids, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like that pride wasn't something I had to hide. The conversation with Claire was a turning point, but it didn't instantly fix everything. Change, especially change in people's perceptions, takes time. Still, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I'd spoken my truth, and even if Claire didn't fully understand everything, she'd at least acknowledged how I felt. That was more than I could say for a lot of people in my life. The next few days were quieter. Claire seemed more considerate, especially around Sophie. I caught her taking more time to listen when Sophie talked about her day, and there was less of that dismissive, "Oh, it's just a phase" attitude she sometimes had. But of course, that didn't mean everything was perfect. Sophie, for one, still had her moments. Kids are funny that way. They don't always understand the complexities of adult emotions or relationships. One afternoon, after picking up Sophie from school, she asked me, "When are you going to get a job, like Daniel?" It wasn't the first time she'd said something like that, but each time, it stung. Sophie wasn't trying to hurt me. She was just speaking from the way she saw things. Still, it reminded me of how deep these perceptions ran, even in a child's mind. "Why do you think I don't have a job, sweetie?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Even though the question weighed on me, she shrugged, clearly not understanding how complex my situation was. "You stay home with me and Liam, but Daniel goes to work every day. Isn't that what dads are supposed to do?" I bit my lip, trying not to let my frustration show. Well, every family is different. Some dads work at an office, but some dads work from home, like me. Or they do other things to help take care of the family. Sophie didn't seem fully convinced, but she didn't press the issue. We carried on with our day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that these kinds of questions would keep popping up, especially if they weren't addressed in a way she could really understand. It wasn't just Sophie either. I noticed that whenever we ran into people, whether it was at the grocery store or the park, there was always that moment where they would ask, "So, what do you do for work?" Or comment on how nice it must be to be at home all the time. Most people didn't mean any harm by it, but it often felt like a quiet judgment hanging in the air. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was always walking around with a bit of an invisible label on my forehead. Stay-at-home dad. There was a certain stigma to it, and I hated how people didn't take it as seriously as they should. It wasn't just the world outside either. Sometimes, when I'd talk to Emily or other friends, they'd casually ask how things were going, but the conversation would always turn toward how I was keeping busy or doing all right. It's as if they expected me to be constantly hustling for something more, something outside of just being a dad. There were days when I felt like I was being measured against some invisible yardstick that didn't have anything to do with who I actually was. Maybe it was society, maybe it was me, but the expectations were always there. But here's the thing, I was doing something. I was raising my kids. I was there every day, taking them to school, cooking their meals, helping with homework, and listening when they needed to talk. Maybe it wasn't the same as a 9-to-5 job, but it mattered. It mattered to them. And it mattered to me. That day, after Sophie asked her question, I decided to take action. I needed to make a change. I wasn't going to keep getting stuck in this loop of defending my role or letting other people define what it meant to be a real dad. I knew I had to start setting boundaries with people, especially when it came to talking about my choices. I needed to be assertive in a way that didn't feel confrontational, but still made my point clear. It was a delicate balance, but I was ready to find it. I thought about the conversation with Claire and realized that this was something I needed to have with everyone: family, friends, even strangers. If I kept brushing it off, I'd just keep feeling resentful. I wasn't going to let my role as a dad be something I had to apologize for anymore. That night, after the kids went to bed, I sat down with Emily to talk. I've been thinking about something, I began, looking over at her. I need to be more vocal about what I do and why it matters. I can't keep letting people make me feel like I'm not contributing enough just because I'm not working outside the home. Emily raised her eyebrows but didn't interrupt. You're talking about your role as a dad, right? Exactly, I said, nodding. I need to stop letting people treat my parenting like it's less than what Daniel does. I'm doing just as much, and I deserve to be seen for it. Maybe even more, sometimes. Emily smiled gently, giving me a reassuring nod. I get it. You're doing amazing, Ollie. I've got your back, and I know the kids do too. You just have to keep reminding yourself of that when the world doesn't see it. I took a deep breath, feeling a little more confident with each word she said. This wasn't going to be easy. I knew that. But I was finally ready to make my role as a dad something I was proud of, something that didn't need to be validated by anyone else. It was time to show the world, but most importantly, show myself that being a stay-at-home dad wasn't any less valuable than any other job out there. The next few weeks felt like a mix of small victories and frustrating setbacks. I was putting my foot down more often, especially with people who tried to minimize my role. It wasn't always easy sometimes. The comments felt too casual or too pointed, and I found myself biting my tongue more than I liked. But it was starting to feel like I had a little more control over the narrative, even if only in my own life. One afternoon, while Sophie was off playing with Liam, I found myself talking to Claire again. This time, it wasn't about parenting. It wasn't about the kids or the house. It was about us, about how I felt about the way I was living, and how I was finally starting to embrace it. I didn't need her to approve of everything, but I needed her to understand. I've been thinking, I said as we sat down on the back porch, the evening sun casting a soft golden glow over everything. I've been feeling like I've been invisible in a way. Like, I'm just the guy who's here. I'm here for the kids. I'm here for the house. But sometimes it feels like that's all anyone sees me as. Claire glanced at me, her face softening. I get that. I really do. It's tough when you feel like you're not seen for the work you put in. I nodded, thankful for her understanding. Exactly. I don't think people get it. Raising kids, taking care of the house, making sure everyone is okay, it's all work. It's not just some part-time thing, but the world doesn't value it the same way as if I were going out to work 9 hours a day. She took a long breath, and for a second, I thought maybe she was going to give me the typical response. The one where people try to make you feel better with cliches. But Claire surprised me. You're right. I never thought about it that way. I mean, sure, I've seen what you do, but I never really stopped to appreciate how hard it is. We just get caught up in what's expected, It hit me hard how much we all get caught in the cycle of expectation. Claire wasn't the problem. The issue was bigger than that. Society had these unspoken rules about what makes a person valuable, and a stay-at-home dad didn't quite fit those rules. It felt like the world had designed a script, and anyone who stepped off of it had to constantly fight to be seen. But something in me shifted. I wasn't going to keep fighting for their approval anymore. I didn't need it. That weekend, we had a family gathering at Emily's house. It was the first time in a while where everyone was together: her, Daniel, their kids, Sophie, and Liam. I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I'd been so caught up in trying to assert myself that I'd been holding my breath a little, waiting for something to happen. The kids ran off to play as usual, leaving the adults in the kitchen. Daniel came up to me with a beer in hand, the same easygoing smile on his face. "How's everything been going?" he asked, like we hadn't had that conversation 100 times before. I wanted to brush it off, to say fine, and keep moving. But I didn't. Not this time. "Actually," I said, looking him in the eye, "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About what I do, about how I'm seen, and about what that means. I don't want to just be the guy who stays home anymore. I want people to understand that it's not easy, that it's important. Raising kids is hard work, Daniel, and I'm doing it every day." The words came out more firmly than I expected, and for a second, I wasn't sure how he'd react. Would he laugh it off? Dismiss me? But to my surprise, he just nodded slowly. "I hear you, Ollie, and I get it. I really do. You've always been there for your kids, and that matters. Maybe I've taken that for granted, not really stopped to think about how much it takes." That was the moment I realized something important. I wasn't the only one who needed to change. It wasn't just about how I felt, it was about helping the people around me see things differently too. They didn't have to agree with everything, but they needed to understand that my role mattered just as much as anyone else's. The rest of the day went smoothly. There were no awkward silences or pointed questions. There was just a lot of good food, laughter, and the kind of easy camaraderie that comes with being around people who really care about you. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the end of the journey. I knew there would be times when I'd have to keep asserting myself. There would still be moments when I felt misunderstood or underestimated. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the right path. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had a voice, and I was finally using it. The weight that had been hanging over me was lighter now, and I was ready to keep pushing forward. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to myself that I was enough, just as I was.